In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than death. Among the most terrible is to stand upon a world marked for destruction, watching the sky darken with approaching doom, knowing that the Imperium has already written you off. You are not a soldier chosen for glory, not a noble afforded escape, not valuable enough to warrant salvation. You are simply one of billions deemed expendable in the cold calculus of galactic survival. This is what it means to be left behind on a doomed planet in Warhammer 40,000. The day the sky changed. You remember the day everything changed with a clarity that will haunt whatever time remains to you. Perhaps you were working your shift in the lower manufactorum levels, the rhythmic pounding of machinery drowning out all thought as it had for your entire life. Perhaps you were navigating the Warren-like passages of the underhive, trading scavenged parts for a few nutrient cubes. Perhaps you were among the fortunate few in the mid-levels, gazing through dirty windows at the perpetual twilight that passes for day on your hive world. Then came the moment when the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. For some worlds, the change arrives as a literal transformation of the heavens. The sun, which you've never seen clearly through layers of industrial smog and chemical haze, suddenly burns with an unnatural hue. Perhaps it's the sickly green of encroaching chaos corruption, reality itself beginning to fray at the edges as the warp presses against the thin membrane, separating existence from madness. Perhaps it's the shadow that isn't a shadow at all, but the blotting out of stars by a living tide of tyrannid bioships, countless millions of organic vessels descending like locusts upon your world. Or perhaps the change comes more subtly, a shift in the air that makes your skin crawl, a wrongness that defies description, but that every human instinct screams at you to flee from. The first time you notice that the rats in the underhive are fleeing en masse toward the spaceports, driven by survival instincts older than civilization. The moment when the ever-present background hum of the hive city changes pitch, as if the entire artificial mountain of humanity is groaning in anticipation of what's coming. In those initial hours, most people don't understand what's happening. Life in a hive city is characterized by ignorance and isolation. You live your entire existence within a few square kilometers of tunnels and chambers, never seeing the sky, never knowing what happens beyond your immediate surroundings. The ruling classes keep it this way deliberately. An informed population is a dangerous population, capable of panic, capable of rebellion, capable of demanding resources that might be better spent elsewhere. So when the first warnings blare through the voxcasters, most people don't understand the technical language being used. Terms like xenos incursion, or daemonic manifestation, or compliance, failure mean nothing to someone who has spent 40 years working the same assembly line, whose education consists of knowing how to operate machinery and how to pray to the God Emperor. The announcements speak of defensive preparations and population management protocols and tithe requirements. But what do these abstract phrases mean to you, standing in a crowd of 10,000 workers all trying to hear the crackling broadcast? It's not until you see the first military movements that the reality begins to sink in. The planetary defense forces, usually scattered in small garrison posts throughout the hive, suddenly mobilize in force. Entire regiments appear on streets that rarely see more than a few scattered patrol units. The PDF troopers move with grim purpose, establishing checkpoints, requisitioning vehicles, commandeering buildings for defensive positions. Then come the off-worlders. The Imperial Guard regiments that garrison your planet go from their barracks in a disciplined flood of armor and weaponry. These are the elite forces, better equipped and better trained than your local PDF. Their deployment is never a good sign. It means the threat is serious enough to warrant using forces that the Imperium might need elsewhere. It means your world is important enough to defend, at least for now. But it's what happens next that truly marks the beginning of the end. The upper levels of the hive, where the nobility and planetary officials dwell in their spires of crystal and gold, suddenly erupt with activity. Shuttles that normally make perhaps 1 or 2 trips per day begin launching in rapid succession. Small private ships, their hulls bearing the seals of noble houses and merchant combines, scream toward orbit in a desperate rush. The wealthy are evacuating. And that's when you understand. That's when everyone understands. The people who rule your world, the people who have always claimed to be your protectors and shepherds, are running. They're saving themselves and leaving you behind. Understanding your fate. In the Imperium of man, there exists a brutal hierarchy of value, and you are learning exactly where you fall within it. The reality is simple and merciless. There are not enough ships to evacuate everyone. There have never been enough ships. Even if every available transport in the system were pressed into service, even if they ran constant flights until the enemy arrived, even if they packed refugees so tightly that many would suffocate in transit, it would not be enough. Your hive city alone houses somewhere between 10 and 100 billion people. The exact number is unknown, even to the administratum bureaucrats who are supposed to track such things. Records are centuries out of date. Entire sectors of the underhive have been lost to the official census for millennia, and the population breeds far faster than anyone can count. When pressed to provide an estimate, the officials will shrug and say, enough to meet the tithe, which tells you everything about how the Imperium views your worth. A typical transport ship might carry 10,000 people if packed to dangerous capacity. The largest bulk haulers, the massive chartist vessels that move goods between star systems, might manage 100,000 in an emergency. Even being generous with the numbers, even assuming every transport in the system participates in the evacuation, you're looking at perhaps a few million people saved at most. A few million out of billions. The calculus is simple, brutal, and absolute. Most of you will die here. But who gets to be among the saved? That question drives every subsequent hour of your doomed world's final days. The answer reveals the truth about the Imperium's values, stripping away all pretense of the Emperor's love for his subjects, exposing the cold machinery of power that truly governs the galaxy. First to evacuate are the planetary elite, the governor and their immediate family, the heads of the major noble houses, the high-ranking ecclesiarchy officials, who have spent their careers preaching about duty and sacrifice from gilded pulpits. They leave within hours of the first credible threat assessment, their private ships and requisitioned military transports carrying them to safety, while broadcast systems still assure the general population that everything is under control. Close behind them come the essential personnel, though essential is defined very narrowly. Tech priests who possess irreplaceable knowledge about maintaining ancient machinery. Administratum officials who hold critical records in their augmented memory banks. Astropaths and sanctioned psychers whose abilities make them valuable commodities. These people are assets, their knowledge and skills deemed worth preserving, even if it means leaving millions to die. Then come the military forces, but even here, selection is ruthless. The off-world Imperial Guard regiments will be evacuated before local PDF forces. The better equipped and better trained units take priority over garrison troops. Specialist formations like armored companies or artillery batteries are saved over basic infantry, and individual soldiers are judged based on their equipment and experience. A veteran tank commander might earn a spot on an evacuation transport, while a fresh conscript with a laser gun is told to hold the line until relieved, knowing that relief will never come. As for you, as for the billions of ordinary citizens who keep the hive functioning through their labor, you are expendable. The Imperium will manufacture more workers. It always does. Hive worlds breed people faster than any war can kill them. And there are always more colonists, more conscripts, more bodies to throw into the machine. Your individual life means nothing when measured against the Imperium's strategic concerns. This truth is so obvious, so undeniable, that even the propaganda broadcasts don't really try to hide it. They speak in euphemisms, certainly. They talk about prioritized evacuation of critical assets, an optimal resource allocation, and maintaining defensive capabilities. But everyone knows what these phrases mean. They mean you don't matter enough to save. Some of you might harbor hope in those early days. Perhaps you have skills that could be valuable. You're a skilled metal worker. Surely they need those. You're a Prometheum refinery operator. Doesn't that make you essential? You're a medici orderly. Won't they need medical staff wherever they're going? The crushing answer comes when you present yourself at the evacuation centers, if you can even reach them through the crowds and chaos. The officials barely glance at your work papers. They've seen thousands just like you, each one thinking they're special enough to warrant salvation. The Space Marines are not loading their Thunderhawks with factory workers and nurses. The Navy vessels racing toward orbit are not stopping to collect refugees. The merchant vessels that might take on additional passengers if the price is right, are demanding payment that would take you 10 lifetimes to earn. You begin to understand a fundamental truth about the Imperium. All the sermons about the Emperor's love, all the propaganda about humanity standing united against the darkness, all the promises that loyalty will be rewarded, they were always lies. Or rather, they were truths that applied to other people, more important people, people whose deaths would actually be noticed. You were never part of that equation. You were always just numbers in a ledger, expendable units of labor to be used up and discarded when convenient. This realization breaks something in many people, not immediately, not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. The social contract that has held your world together, the unspoken agreement that if you work hard and follow the rules and serve the Emperor faithfully, you will be protected. That contract is revealed as fiction. And when people realize they've been betrayed, when they understand they were always meant to be sacrificed, the foundations of society begin to crumble. The hierarchy of abandonment. Even among the abandoned, hierarchies persist. Even in the face of extinction, humans cling to their social structures, their prejudices, their desperate attempts to find meaning in chaos by establishing who stands above and who stands below. When salvation is impossible for most, people stratify into categories based on how long they might survive, how comfortable their final days might be, how they will be remembered, if at all. At the top of this hierarchy of the damned are those who still retain some semblance of power and choice. These are the people who couldn't secure off-world evacuation, but who have resources that matter in the short term. Wealthy merchants who missed the first waves of evacuation, but who control stockpiles of food and water. Mid-level nobles whose houses weren't important enough to merit immediate rescue, but who have fortified estates and private security forces. Gang leaders from the Underhive who command enough armed followers to carve out temporary strongholds against the coming storm. These people will not survive the world's destruction, but they will die more comfortably than most. They retreat to their fortresses and mansions, their private bunkers and reinforced compounds. They hoard supplies while others starve. They maintain their lifestyles for days or weeks longer than those outside their walls. Some even convince themselves that perhaps they can survive whatever's coming, that their wealth and power must count for something, that the Emperor will not truly allow them to perish. This delusion manifests in grotesque ways. There are stories from doomed worlds of nobles hosting elaborate banquets, even as enemies close in on their positions. Of merchant princes organizing auctions where terrified servants bid their life savings for spots in bunkers that won't save anyone. Of gang lords declaring themselves kings of worthless domains, ruling over ruins with all the ceremony of genuine monarchs. The human need to maintain hierarchy, to preserve the illusion of civilization, persists until the very end. Below them in this grim hierarchy are the military forces left behind to buy time for evacuations that aren't coming. The PDF troopers and Imperial Guard regiments ordered to hold defensive positions, to slow the enemy advance, to die in place so that ships in orbit can complete their loading sequences. These soldiers at least have weapons and purpose, even if that purpose is ultimately futile. For them, the end will come as violence rather than helpless waiting. They will fight and die as soldiers, which is perhaps a better fate than most can hope for. The Imperium tells them they are heroes, that their sacrifice will be remembered, that they serve the Emperor with honor. These words ring hollow when you know you've been abandoned, but they provide structure to what remains of your life. You have orders to follow, positions to defend, enemies to kill before they kill you. The bitterness among these abandoned soldiers is profound. They can see the ships leaving orbit, can watch on their Vox displays as the evacuation fleets depart. They know that nobles who never held a weapon are safe, while they've been left to die. Some units maintain discipline through the end, their training and faith holding them together. Others fracture, officers being shot by their own men, wholesale desertions as soldiers decide to spend their final hours with family rather than dying for commanders who abandoned them. Then there are the general populace, the billions who have neither power nor purpose, who can do nothing but watch as their world ends. These are the factory workers and hab block dwellers, the market vendors and transit operators, the vast, teeming masses who were the foundation of the hive city's existence, but who now find themselves without function or value. For them, the hierarchy subdivides further based on location and luck. Those in the upper and middle levels of the hive at least have some access to information, some ability to understand what's happening and attempt to respond. They might try to reach evacuation points, even though those points are overwhelmed and accepting almost no one. They might attempt to flee to areas of the hive that seem safer, though nowhere is truly safe. They might gather their families and whatever supplies they can carry and simply wait, hoping for a miracle that will not come. But consider those in the underhive, the lowest levels, where humanity clings to existence in conditions that would horrify anyone raised in better circumstances. These are the people who live in darkness and squalor, who survive on recycled waste and whatever they can scavenge, who have always been forgotten by the powers above. For them, the coming apocalypse might not even be noticeable at first. Information doesn't reach the deep underhive except as rumor and distortion. The Vox networks don't penetrate that far down. Official broadcasts don't reach populations that have been effectively abandoned for generations. By the time the underhivers realize something catastrophic is happening, it's because the disaster has literally reached their levels, because tyrannid organisms are burrowing up through the ancient foundations, because the hive structure above them is collapsing, because reality itself is tearing apart as chaos corruption spreads downward like contamination through water. For these people, there is no hierarchy, no sorting by value or importance. There is only the sudden, incomprehensible violence of forces they can't understand, destroying everything they've ever known. They don't get time to contemplate their fate or rage against their abandonment. They simply die, uncounted and unmourned, their existence so marginal that no one will ever even record that they were here. And finally, at the very bottom of this hierarchy are those who have already been written off, not just by the Imperium, but by everyone else on the dying world. The hospitalized and bedridden who cannot flee. The imprisoned, locked in cells that will become tombs. The very young and very old who cannot move quickly enough when panic erupts. The mentally ill and the physically disabled who don't understand the danger or who cannot navigate the chaos. These people are the first forgotten. Family members might promise to return for them, but never do. Medical facilities are abandoned by staff, leaving patients to starve or die from lack of care. Prison guards simply walk away, leaving inmates behind locked doors. In the mad scramble for survival, those who cannot keep up are left behind without ceremony or regret. Their deaths will come slowly, through abandonment and neglect, long before the actual enemy arrives. This is the truth of a doomed world. Even in extinction, humanity cannot escape its nature. We stratify, we judge, we decide who matters more, who deserves better treatment, who should suffer less. We maintain our hierarchies until the very end. as if social status will somehow matter when everything is destroyed. And in doing so, we add layers of cruelty and betrayal to what would be terrible enough already. Life in a hive city under siege. The first days after the evacuation order bring a strange kind of numbness. The initial panic has subsided, not because people have found hope, but because terror cannot be sustained indefinitely. The human mind adapts, even to the knowledge of impending doom. You return to something resembling routine, even though you know that routine is temporary and meaningless. But the hive city is changing around you in ways both subtle and profound. The first and most obvious change is the absence. The nobles are gone, the merchant princes have fled, anyone with the means and connections to leave has left. This creates a vacuum of power and authority that begins to fill in unexpected ways. Without the Arbites to enforce law, without the noble houses to maintain their private security forces, without the usual mechanisms of control, the hive descends into a strange mixture of anarchy and desperate self-organization. In some sectors, community leaders emerge, people trying to maintain order and distribute resources fairly. In others, the strongest and most violent seize control, creating petty empires that will last only days or weeks. The manufactorums and factories that have defined your life's rhythm begin to shut down. There's no one to organize the work shifts anymore, no overseers to enforce quotas, no point in producing goods that will never be shipped or used. The machinery that has run continuously for centuries, that has created a constant background thunder through the hive, begins to fall silent. That silence is profoundly disturbing, like the heartbeat of a vast organism faltering. Some people continue to report to their workstations anyway, unable to break the habits of a lifetime. They stand at idle machines, going through the motions of their jobs, finding comfort in routine, even when that routine serves no purpose. Others loot the now unguarded facilities, taking whatever they think might be useful: tools, metal, components that might be traded or repurposed. The line between reasonable salvage and simple theft has ceased to exist. The supply chains that kept the hive functioning begin to collapse. Food production and distribution, always carefully managed to prevent starvation while extracting maximum labor from the population, breaks down entirely. The upper levels, which always received the best supplies, find their deliveries stopping. The lower levels, which survived on scraps and recycled nutrients, find even those scraps unavailable. Starvation becomes a real and immediate threat, perhaps arriving before whatever enemy is approaching the world. The hive cities of the Imperium are completely dependent on imported food. Their populations are far too large to be sustained by local agriculture, even if agriculture were possible on these polluted, industrialized worlds. Every day requires enormous shipments of corpse starch, algae paste, synthetic nutrients, anything that can keep billions of people alive. When those shipments stop, when the ships that would normally arrive daily or weekly simply don't come anymore, the hive has perhaps a week's worth of reserves in the best case. Then people begin to starve. The markets and food distribution centers are looted within hours. Wealthy merchants who hoarded supplies find their warehouses besieged by desperate crowds. Violence erupts over scraps that wouldn't have fed a person for a day under normal circumstances. This is when you see humanity at its worst, and occasionally at its surprising best. There are people who will kill over a single ration bar, who will trample children to reach a food cache, who revert to the most brutal survival instincts imaginable. But there are also those who share what little they have, who organize community kitchens with dwindling supplies, who protect the weak rather than exploiting them. Water becomes another crisis. The hive city's water recycling systems are ancient and complex, requiring constant maintenance by tech priests and trained operators. When those operators abandon their posts or are killed in the chaos, the systems begin to fail. Entire sectors find their water supplies contaminated or shut off entirely. People begin dying of thirst in a city that has always had water, however poor the quality. power failures begin cascading through the hive levels. The massive generatorium complexes that provide electricity to billions require fuel, maintenance, and skilled operators. As these resources become unavailable, sections of the hive go dark. The perpetual artificial lighting that has been the only illumination for most residents, that has substituted for the sun they've never seen, begins to flicker and fail. Living in a darkened hive level is an experience of profound terror. These structures were never designed to be navigated without light. The passages are labyrinthine, filled with sudden drops, industrial hazards, unstable structures. In the darkness, people become lost in areas they've traversed their entire lives. They fall down maintenance shafts, stumble into chemical pools, become separated from their families, and die alone in the dark. The darkness also breeds paranoia and violence. You cannot see who's approaching you. Every sound might be a threat. Groups begin attacking each other over imagined slights or out of simple fear. The gangers and criminals who have always existed in the hive's shadows become bolder, preying on the vulnerable without fear of consequences. Medical care ceases to exist in any organized form. The medici facilities are overwhelmed immediately, then abandoned as staff flee or die. Injuries and illnesses that would have been treatable become death sentences. A simple infection, a broken bone, even dehydration becomes fatal when there's no one to provide treatment. Bodies begin accumulating in the hab blocks and corridors, adding disease to the list of threats facing the population. Social bonds start to fracture under the pressure. Families stay together at first, but as resources dwindle, difficult decisions must be made. Can you share your last ration with your sibling when you're already starving? Do you abandon an elderly parent who can't keep up when fleeing danger? Do you sacrifice yourself so your children might have a slightly better chance? Or do you cling to life and let them fend for themselves? These are choices that destroy souls, even when they don't destroy bodies. People who make them, who survive them, carry guilt and trauma that can never be resolved, because there will never be a future where they can seek redemption or forgiveness. They will die knowing the worst things they've done, with no opportunity to ever make amends. Religious fervor intensifies to manic levels. The ecclesiarchy priests who remain, either trapped by circumstances or choosing to stay with their flocks, preach with renewed desperation. They promise that the emperor will save the faithful, that divine intervention will arrive at the last moment, that suffering is a test of devotion. Some people find genuine comfort in these sermons. Others see them for the lies they are and abandon faith entirely, cursing the emperor who has abandoned them. Suicide rates spike dramatically. When hope is gone and the future holds only suffering followed by death, many choose to end things on their own terms. Some die quietly, taking whatever substances they can find to drift into unconsciousness. Others choose more dramatic exits, throwing themselves from the hive's upper levels, or simply walking into the industrial hazards that fill the lower levels. The authorities who would normally prevent such acts are gone, and no one has the resources or motivation to stop people anymore. Time itself begins to feel distorted. Without the normal rhythms of work shifts and mandatory rest periods, without the artificial day-night cycles that structured hive life, people lose track of how long they've been waiting for the end. Has it been days or weeks since the evacuation began? How long until the enemy arrives? The uncertainty is its own form of torture, stretching and compressing time until it loses all meaning. The many faces of doom. Not all apocalypses are created equal. The manner of your world's destruction shapes the nature of your final days, determines what horrors you will witness before the end, defines what small mercies or additional cruelties await you. The Imperium faces threats from all directions, and each enemy brings its own particular form of extinction. If tyrannids have marked your world for consumption, you face perhaps the most inevitable and comprehensive doom imaginable. The hive mind does not negotiate, does not show mercy, cannot be reasoned with or appealed to. Your world is simply food. and you are merely a component of that meal, no different in the tyrannid's consideration than the microbes in your soil or the fish in your oceans. The invasion begins subtly, often years before you realize you're threatened. Genestealer cults have been spreading through your population, their members marked by subtle mutations and an unwavering loyalty to gods they don't truly understand. These cultists have been sabotaging defenses, gathering intelligence, waiting for the signal that will never come from their own minds, but from the vast alien consciousness descending from the void. When the hive fleet arrives, the sky fills with bioships, organic vessels that defy human understanding of what a spacecraft should be. They're alive in ways that make your skin crawl, pulsing with unnatural rhythms, growing and adapting even as you watch them. The shadow in the warp descends like a psychic shroud, cutting off all astropathic communication, preventing any calls for help, driving psychers mad or killing them outright with the pressure of 1 billion alien minds. The spores begin falling almost immediately, millions of them, each one containing organisms designed for a specific purpose. Some carry warrior forms that will attack directly. Others contain microorganisms that will begin transforming your world's entire biosphere into something more suitable for tyrannid consumption. Within hours, you watch as vegetation mutates, as the very ground beneath your feet begins to writhe with alien life. The attacks, when they come, are overwhelming. Hormagaunts by the thousands, moving with inhuman speed and coordination, tearing through defensive positions. Carnifexes smashing through fortifications like they're made of paper. Lictors stalking through the hive, killing leaders and key personnel with surgical precision. Every tyrannid organism works in perfect synchronization with every other, directed by the hive mind's intelligence toward a single goal: total consumption. For you, trapped in the hive with no means of escape, the end comes as the city is overrun, level by level. You hear the screaming getting closer, hear the sound of claws on metal, hear the wet tearing sounds as people are ripped apart. You might try to hide, but the tyrannids have organisms specifically designed to root out every pocket of resistance, every hidden survivor. They find you eventually. They always do. Death by tyrannid is usually quick, but rarely clean. If you're fortunate, a warrior organism will simply rend you apart in moments, too fast for prolonged suffering. If you're less fortunate, you're taken alive, infected with tyrannid organisms that begin converting your body's biomass while you still live. Feeling
yourself being digested from the inside out. Or you might be herded toward the digestion pools, massive organic structures where all the planet's life is being rendered down into nutrient-rich soup, and you walk into them yourself, your mind no longer your own, controlled by tyrannid organisms that have invaded your nervous system. The worst part is the totality of it. The tyrannids don't just kill you, they erase you. They consume everything, right down to the molecular level. Your body, your bones, the very ground you stood on, the air you breathed, all of it rendered into biomass and pumped up to the hive fleet through towering capillary towers. When they leave, your world will be a lifeless rock, sterile and barren, with no trace that humanity ever existed there. You will not even leave a corpse to mark your passing. If chaos has come for your world, the horror is different, and in some ways worse, because it violates not just your body, but your soul. Chaos corruption usually begins subtly, with cults forming in the underhive or among disenfranchised populations. These cults offer power, pleasure, purpose, things that the Imperium has always denied you. They grow slowly, spreading their influence, corrupting officials and security forces, preparing for the day when they can strike openly. When that day comes, when the cults rise in rebellion and Chaos Space Marines descend from the warp, your world transforms into something from your darkest nightmares. The physical laws of reality begin to break down as the warp bleeds through into real space. You see impossible things, geometries that hurt to look at, colors that don't exist, sounds that somehow also taste and smell and feel. The corruption spreads like a plague, both literal and spiritual. Nurgle's followers bring actual diseases that transform people into shambling plague zombies, or worse. Khorne's cultists erupt in orgies of violence, killing anyone they can reach and offering the blood to their brutal god. Slaaneish's devotees pursue ever more extreme pleasures and sensations, torturing and defiling without limit or restraint. Tzeentch's followers warp reality itself, causing mutations and transformations that leave victims as twisted mockeries of their former selves. Perhaps most terrifying is that chaos is seductive. In your desperation and despair, you might find yourself drawn to it. The promises whispered by cultists start to make terrible sense. Why not seek pleasure if you're going to die anyway? Why not embrace the rage and kill those who abandoned you? Why not accept transformation if remaining human only means prolonged suffering? The temptation is real, and many succumb, joining the very forces destroying their world. If you resist, if you cling to your humanity and your faith in the Emperor, you watch as your world becomes unrecognizable. Buildings melt and reform into organic structures covered in mouths and eyes. The sky tears open to reveal the warp itself, madness given, visible form. Your neighbors and family transform into something no longer human, and you can see in their eyes that some horrible part of them is still aware, still trapped in bodies that no longer respond to their will. Exterminatus might be ordered before chaos fully claims your world, but that's a mercy that often doesn't come in time. Instead, your planet becomes a demon world, a realm where the warp and reality merge, where natural laws are replaced by the whims of whatever entity rules it. If some fragment of you survives in this new reality, you will endure an eternity of torment, for time itself becomes meaningless in such places. Death would be a blessing that is forever denied. If orcs have invaded, the apocalypse comes with a twisted mockery of joy. The greenskins don't fight out of malice or hunger or spiritual corruption. They fight because they enjoy it, because war is their natural state and purpose. Their invasion is chaos and carnage, but it's an almost innocent kind of destruction, if such a thing can be imagined. The Orc War descends from space in a storm of ramshackle ships that shouldn't be able to fly, but do anyway, held together by orc belief as much as by actual engineering. They crash land across your world, not caring about casualties because for orcs, dying in battle is the greatest fate imaginable. Within minutes of landing, they're attacking anything that moves, shooting their crude weapons in all directions, charging into combat with roaring enthusiasm. For you, the end comes as your defenses are overwhelmed by sheer numbers and enthusiasm. The orcs don't employ sophisticated tactics. They just keep coming, wave after wave, each one eager for the chance to fight. They're incredibly tough, capable of surviving wounds that would kill a human instantly, and they grow larger and stronger the more they fight. What starts as a manageable invasion becomes overwhelming as more and more orcs arrive, drawn by the fighting like moths to flame. Your death by orc is likely to be violent and relatively quick. They're brutal combatants, wielding massive choppers and crude firearms, but they usually kill you outright, rather than torturing or corrupting. If you're captured, you might be kept alive for entertainment, forced to fight in gladiatorial combats for orc amusement, but at least you remain fundamentally yourself, not transformed into something else. The strange mercy of an orc invasion is that they might not consume your entire world. If they defeat your defenders and claim the planet, they'll settle in and use it as a base for future wogs. You might survive as a slave or in hiding, living in the ruins of your civilization, oppressed by Xenos masters, but at least alive. It's not much of a mercy, but it's more than Tyranids or chaos would offer. Necron Awakening presents a different kind of doom, one characterized by cold efficiency rather than hungry consumption or chaotic destruction.
the first sign of Necron. Presence is often subtle. Equipment malfunctions, reports of strange metallic structures emerging from the ground, people disappearing without a trace. The Mechanicus might be called in to investigate, their tech priests fascinated by technology they can barely comprehend, not realizing they're studying weapons that will soon be turned against them. When the Necrons fully awaken, they emerge from tombs buried beneath your world's surface, constructs of living metal that were ancient when humanity was young. They move with eerie silence and precision, their weapons reducing human bodies to component atoms with beams of green energy. There's no passion in their attacks, no rage or hunger, just cold, methodical extermination of what they see as vermin infesting their property. You cannot reason with Necrons, cannot appeal to their mercy, because most of them don't even register you as being worthy of consideration. You're an obstacle to be removed, nothing more. They don't consume your biomass or corrupt your soul. They simply erase you, efficiently and thoroughly, reclaiming the world that was theirs long before humanity existed. The terror of facing Necrons is their inexorability. You can kill them, reduce them to pieces with heavy weapons, but they simply regenerate and continue advancing. Even destroying them completely might only send them back to their tombs to be reconstructed and deployed again. They never tire, never rout, never stop. They advance at a measured pace, methodically clearing each sector, each building, each room, until nothing living remains. Your death by Necron is at least quick and clean. The Gauss weapons they wield don't cause pain as much as they simply unmake you, stripping away layers of matter until nothing remains. One moment you exist, the next you don't, with very little transition between states. If there's any comfort to be found in extinction, perhaps it's in the efficiency of it. The descent into chaos. As days stretch into weeks, as hope fades and resources dwindle, the social order that has always defined life in the hive city collapses completely. What remains is a descent into violence and madness, a breaking of all the bonds that held civilization together. The first victims are always the weakest. The elderly who cannot fight for resources are abandoned or killed. Children, if they're fortunate, are protected by their parents, but more often they become orphans, struggling to survive in a nightmare world that offers them no protection or mercy. The sick and injured are left to die because no one has the resources to care for them, and their suffering serves no purpose except to burden others. Religious extremism flourishes in the vacuum. Radical preachers emerge, claiming that the apocalypse is punishment for insufficient faith, that the emperor is testing the population, that only through extreme devotion and purity can anyone hope for salvation. These preachers gather followers who become increasingly fanatical, seeing heretics and mutants everywhere, conducting purges and executions based on the flimsiest accusations or no evidence at all. Some of these groups turn their violence inward, practicing mortification and self-flagellation, believing that suffering will somehow earn them divine intervention. Others turn their violence outward, conducting pogroms against anyone they consider impure. Mutants who have always existed in the underhive, people of different social classes, anyone who expresses doubt or questions their dogma. The hive becomes a patchwork of small theocracies, each one convinced of their righteousness, all of them doomed. Chaos cults that have hidden in the shadows for years or decades see their opportunity and emerge into the open. They no longer need to conceal their true nature, no longer fear the Arbites or Inquisition. They preach openly about the power of the dark gods, promising salvation through surrender to chaos, offering immediate gratification and transformation in exchange for faith. For people who have lost everything, who have been betrayed by the Imperium and abandoned to die, these promises hold terrible appeal. Why not seek pleasure if you're doomed? Why not embrace power if it's offered? Why not rage against the universe that has shown you only cruelty? The chaos cults grow rapidly,
their rituals becoming more elaborate and disturbing, their transformations more evident and grotesque. Gang warfare erupts throughout the hive as different factions fight for control of dwindling resources. These conflicts are short and brutal, waged with improvised weapons and desperate tactics. There are no rules of engagement, no attempt to spare civilians or avoid collateral damage. Entire hab blocks are burned out in gang wars, their populations killed or dispersed over control of a water recycling station or a cache of food. Cannibalism becomes first whispered about, then common. When all other food sources are exhausted, when people are literally starving to death, the taboo against eating human flesh begins to erode. It starts with the dead, corpses that would otherwise rot being processed into something edible. Then it progresses to murder for meat, with the weak and isolated being hunted by the desperate. Eventually, in the deepest parts of the hive, it becomes systematized, with organized groups capturing and processing people for food. The psychological toll of this descent is profound. You watch yourself becoming something you would have found monstrous before all this started. You've done things to survive that violate every principle you once held. You've abandoned people who needed help, have taken resources from those weaker than you, have looked away while atrocities occurred because intervening would have endangered you. The guilt and self-loathing are crushing, but survival instinct overpowers morality. Madness spreads through the population like a contagion. People snap under the heat, strain, losing touch with reality, retreating into delusions that protect them from acknowledging their situation. You encounter individuals who act as if nothing is wrong, going through the motions of their old lives in hive sectors that no longer function. Others become catatonic, simply shutting down and waiting for death. Still others become violently unstable, lashing out at anyone nearby in incoherent rage. The physical environment degrades in parallel with social collapse. Fires rage unchecked through hab blocks, consuming entire sectors because there's no one to fight them. Structural failures become common as maintenance ceases, causing collapses that kill thousands. Chemical and radiological hazards leak from unattended industrial sites, poisoning air and water, creating dead zones where nothing can survive. Bodies accumulate everywhere, in corridors and rooms and public spaces, because there's no one to dispose of them and nowhere to put them even if there were. They rot and spread disease, attracting vermin, creating a miasma of death that permeates the hive. You become accustomed to the smell, to stepping over corpses, to the constant presence of decay. It becomes your new normal, so pervasive that you stop really noticing it. The environmental systems that have always sustained life in the hive begin their final failures. Air recycling systems break down, leaving sectors with unbreathable atmosphere, carbon dioxide building up to lethal levels, or toxic industrial gases leaking in from processing facilities. People suffocate in their own hab units, too weak to move to areas with better air, dying in their sleep as oxygen levels drop. Temperature regulation fails, and the hive becomes a place of extremes. Some sectors overheat from uncontrolled industrial processes or fire, reaching temperatures that kill everyone within hours. Others freeze as heating systems fail, and the cold of the planet's surface, which has always been kept at bay by artificial warmth, seeps down through the levels. People die of exposure in a hive city, something that should be impossible, but becomes commonplace. Through all of this, you're waiting for the enemy to arrive, waiting for the end to come, waiting for the suffering to stop. The waiting is its own unique torture, stretching time into something elastic and surreal. Each day feels like an eternity, but also the days blur together until you can't remember how long it's been. You're trapped in a liminal state between life and death, not quite either, just existing in an extended moment of horror. The mechanics of evacuation. Even on a doomed world, evacuations continue, though calling them evacuations grants them more order and dignity than they deserve. What actually happens is a chaotic scramble of competing interests and brutal prioritization. a process that saves a relative handful while condemning millions to remain behind. The evacuation centers, when they're established, become focal points of desperate hope and inevitable despair. Massive crowds converge on these sites, often spaceports or large landing fields, driven by the slimmest chance that they might be among those selected to leave. The crowds number in the hundreds of thousands or millions, far exceeding the capacity of any realistic evacuation effort. But people come anyway, because what else is there to do? The authorities who run these centers face an impossible task. They must process potentially millions of desperate refugees with limited resources and time, making life and death decisions about who gets to board the transports and who doesn't. The criteria they use reveal everything about the Imperium's true priorities. Military personnel are typically given first priority, at least among those not already evacuated with their units. Individual soldiers, separated from their formations or left behind in the chaos, can present themselves at evacuation centers with some hope of acceptance. Their training and combat experience make them valuable assets, worth preserving for deployment elsewhere. But even here, triage is brutal. Wounded soldiers who would require significant medical resources are often turned away in favor of those who can immediately return to service. Tech priests and skilled laborers with specialized knowledge are high on the priority list. Someone who knows how to maintain ancient machinery, who possesses technical skills that take decades to develop, might earn a spot on a transport, while 100 ordinary workers are turned away. This creates perverse incentives where people falsely claim skills they don't have, leading to testing and verification that wastes precious time and resources. Administrative personnel are given surprising priority, not for humanitarian reasons, but because the Imperium values its bureaucracy. Someone who has memorized tax records, who knows the details of the planetary tithe, who can reconstruct administrative systems, these people are seen as worth saving even if they've never done physical labor or borne arms. The machine of imperial governance must be preserved, even if the people it governed are abandoned. Children are sometimes prioritized, but only in limited numbers, and with cold calculations behind the selection. Orphans with no family to slow them down, children young enough to be re-educated and integrated into new societies, these might be loaded onto transports. But infants who require constant care, children with disabilities, orphans who are too old to be easily reprogrammed, these are left behind. For the vast majority who approach evacuation centers, the answer is simply no. The officials don't even pretend to consider each case individually. They take one look at you, see nothing that makes you valuable enough to save, and wave you away. If you persist, if you beg or plead or try to force your way forward, you might be shot. The guards around these centers have orders to maintain, order by any means necessary, and killing desperate refugees is well within those orders. Some people attempt to bribe their way onto transports, offering everything they have for a spot on a ship. In some cases, this works. Corrupt officials and ship captains accept payment, usually demanding far more than anyone reasonable could afford, then sometimes honoring the deal, and sometimes simply taking the money and leaving the person behind anyway. Stories circulate about refugees who sold everything, murdered others for their valuables, scraped together a fortune by desperate means, only to be betrayed at the last moment. The ships themselves, when they arrive to load refugees, become scenes of barely controlled chaos. The plan, such as it is, typically involves establishing a perimeter around the landing zone, processing refugees through checkpoints, and loading them in an orderly fashion. In reality, desperate crowds surge toward any ship that lands, overwhelming whatever security exists, trying to force their way aboard through sheer numbers. Some ships simply refuse to land at all, hovering at altitude and using cargo lifters or shuttles to ferry small numbers of people up, while keeping the main vessel out of reach of the crowds below. Others land briefly, load whoever can physically get aboard in the few minutes before they lift off again, and leave before the situation becomes untenable.
Still others never arrive at all, their captains deciding that the risk of being trapped or overwhelmed outweighs any profit or obligation to help. The conditions aboard evacuation ships are uniformly terrible. Refugees are packed into cargo holds designed for goods, not people, with no facilities for sanitation, no food or water provided, minimal life support, and certainly no medical care. People are crammed so tightly they can barely move, standing room only for journeys that might take days or weeks. Deaths from dehydration, suffocation, disease, and simple crushing are common. Ships that began their voyage with 10,000 desperate refugees might arrive at their destination with only 7,000 or 8,000 still alive. The dead left where they fell because there's no room to move the bodies and nowhere to put them. And even those who make it onto ships face uncertain futures. The evacuation vessels aren't heading to pleasant resettlement worlds where refugees will be welcomed and cared for. They're going to whatever destination will accept them, which often means penal colonies, labor camps, or simply being dumped on frontier worlds with minimal resources to survive. Being saved doesn't mean being safe. It just means dying somewhere else, possibly in only slightly better circumstances. For those left behind at the evacuation centers, the final departures of the last ships are moments of absolute despair. You've spent days or weeks hoping, waiting, believing that perhaps you might be selected, that your luck might turn, that someone would recognize your worth or take pity on you. Then you watch the last transport lift off, its engines screaming as it rises toward orbit, and you know with absolute certainty that there will be no more ships, no more chances, no more hope. The crowds at these abandoned centers often turn violent. Rage at the betrayal, at the unfairness of who was chosen and who wasn't, at the simple fact of being left to die, erupts into riots. People attack the officials who ran the selection process, burning buildings and destroying equipment in futile expressions of anger. Others simply collapse into despair, sitting among the ruins and waiting for the end. Some wander away, back toward whatever homes they left, hoping to die in familiar surroundings, rather than at an evacuation center that became a monument to false hope. Those who fight on. Not everyone who remains on a doomed world is a helpless civilian waiting passively for death. Military forces, whether by choice or by order, continue to fight even when they know evacuation is impossible and survival is not an option. These soldiers face a peculiar kind of hell, waging war they know they cannot win, defending a world they know cannot be saved, for purposes that become increasingly questionable as the end approaches. The orders these forces receive are typically phrased in noble language. They're told to buy time for the evacuation, to slow the enemy advance, to defend Imperial territory to the last. The reality is simpler and more brutal. They're being sacrificed to delay the enemy slightly, to allow ships to escape, to deny resources or strategic positions to the enemy. They're fighting and dying so that a few thousand more people can be loaded onto transports, so that classified documents can be destroyed, so that the Imperium can claim that the world fell defending its honor rather than simply being abandoned. For the common soldiers in the PDF or Imperial Guard regiments left behind, the psychological burden is crushing. They can see the evacuation ships launching from orbital platforms. They receive Vox transmissions from units that have already been pulled off-world. They know that people are being saved while they're being left to die. The officers try to maintain morale by emphasizing duty and honor, but these abstractions ring hollow when contrasted with the concrete reality of abandonment. Unit cohesion begins to fracture under this strain. Some formations maintain their discipline through the end, their soldiers finding meaning in following orders and fighting beside their comrades, even when the cause is hopeless. These units often achieve remarkable feats of courage and skill, holding positions far longer than should be possible, making the enemy pay dearly for every meter of ground. Other units fall apart as soldiers make individual decisions about how to spend their final days. Desertions become endemic as troops abandon their posts to search for family members or to simply avoid, dying for commanders who abandoned them. Officers who try to prevent desertion or enforce discipline are sometimes killed by their own men, their authority evaporating in the face of certain doom. Some entire formations simply cease to exist as cohesive military units, dissolving into groups of armed individuals pursuing personal agendas. The tactics employed by these doomed defenders shift as the situation deteriorates. Early on, they might fight conventional defensive battles, holding prepared positions, conducting orderly withdrawals when necessary, maintaining formation integrity. As the situation becomes more desperate and hope for relief disappears entirely, tactics become more brutal and fatalistic. Suicide missions become common. Small units will volunteer to hold critical positions with no possibility of withdrawal, fighting until they're killed to buy a few more hours for evacuation efforts. Demolition teams will stay behind to destroy bridges or seal tunnels after their comrades have passed through, ensuring they're trapped with the enemy when the charges detonate. Artillery batteries will continue firing long after they should have retreated, knowing that their position will be overrun, but determined to inflict maximum damage before the end. Some formations adopt scorched earth policies, destroying everything of potential value to the enemy as they're forced back. They burn food stockpiles, demolish industrial facilities, poison water sources, anything to deny resources to the enemy. This destruction is often indiscriminate, affecting civilian populations who are already suffering. A commander might order the burning of an entire hab sector because it could potentially provide shelter to enemy forces, killing thousands of civilians in the process, justified by the logic that they were all going to die anyway. The last stands of these doomed forces often achieve a strange kind of glory, at least in the records that might survive, if anyone lives to make such records. The Imperial Guard regiment that holds the spaceport until the literal last second, dying on the landing pads as the final evacuation ship lifts off. The PDF company that defends a critical water facility against overwhelming odds, knowing their sacrifice means nothing strategically, but doing it anyway, because it's what they were ordered to do. The tank crew that charges into the enemy's main force, all ammunition expended, just to take a few more enemies with them when their vehicle explodes. But for every story of heroic last stands, there are countless others of soldiers dying in confusion, fear, and bitterness, killed by friendly fire in the chaos of fighting withdrawals, abandoned by their officers who evacuated themselves while ordering their men to hold positions, overrun while waiting for support that was never coming, slowly bleeding out from wounds in the ruins of a world that no one will remember or mourn. For some soldiers, the end comes not in battle, but in the moments after battle, when the fighting is over and they're left wounded or trapped. They lie in the rubble of a collapsed building, their legs crushed, calling for medics who will never come. They huddle in the wreckage of their destroyed vehicle, knowing that enemy forces are approaching and they're too injured to flee or fight. They watch their comrades die one by one from wounds or exposure, knowing their turn is coming. The truly horrible deaths come for those captured alive. Different enemies have different uses for prisoners. Chaos forces might torture captives for entertainment or sacrifice them in dark rituals. Orcs might keep prisoners for gladiatorial combat or simply because they enjoy having targets to shoot at. Dark Eldar raiders, if they're involved in the planet's fall, will take prisoners for their torture arenas, ensuring fates worse than any battlefield death. Even Tyranids might keep some humans alive temporarily, using them as incubation vessels for specially designed organisms, or simply herding them into digestion pools while they're still conscious and aware. Some military forces, knowing that they're doomed but wanting to choose the manner of their end, turn their weapons on themselves. Entire squads will conduct suicide pacts, using their last ammunition to ensure quick deaths for everyone rather than facing whatever the enemy would do to them. Officers will save their last bullet for themselves, determined to die on their own terms. These deaths are rarely recorded or honored, but they represent a final exercise of agency, a last assertion of control over one's fate in in a situation where all control has been lost. The waiting. Between the realization that you're doomed and the actual arrival of that doom lies an expanse of time that becomes its own unique form of torment. You cannot prepare for it adequately. You cannot make peace with it. You can only endure it, hour by hour, day by day, until the waiting finally ends. Time becomes strange when you know it's limited. Each moment feels simultaneously eternal and fleeting. You find yourself obsessing over trivial details, the pattern of rust on a wall, the specific sound of distant machinery, tiny sensory experiences that you'll never have again. But you also lose track of larger spans of time entirely, unable to remember if an event happened yesterday or a week ago, if you've been waiting 3 days or 30. The breakdown of normal temporal structures contributes to this distortion. Work shifts that once divided your days no longer exist. The artificial day-night cycles of the hive have failed or become meaningless. You sleep when exhaustion overwhelms you and wake when hunger or fear drives you to consciousness, not on any schedule. This temporal chaos leaves you unmoored, floating in an endless present that has no clear beginning and whose end approaches but never quite arrives. Different people cope with the waiting in different ways, none of them particularly healthy or productive. Some become manic, filling every moment with desperate activity, as if constant motion can somehow forestall the inevitable. They clean already clean spaces, organize supplies that will never be used, maintain equipment that will never be needed, anything to avoid sitting still and confronting their situation. Others collapse into passivity, sitting motionless for hours or days, barely eating or drinking, not speaking, just existing in a kind of suspended animation. They're waiting for death, but also hiding from it, pulling into themselves as far as they can go, minimizing their engagement with a world that has become too horrible to face directly. Many seek comfort in familiar rituals and routines, even when those rituals have lost all practical meaning. You might continue to wake at the same time you always did for work shifts that no longer exist. You might maintain personal grooming habits even though there's no hygiene facilities and no one to see you. You might pray at regular intervals, even though you've lost faith that anyone is listening. These rituals provide structure, a thin illusion of normalcy in circumstances that are anything but normal. Conversations among the doomed take on strange qualities. People talk obsessively about the past, recounting memories of better times, analyzing old grievances that no longer matter, fixating on moments from their previous lives with an intensity that borders on madness. These conversations serve a purpose, keeping minds engaged, preserving identity through shared history, but they also highlight everything that's been lost. Speculation about the future, even the very near future, dominates other discussions. What will the enemy do when they arrive? How long will the killing take? Will it hurt? Will death be quick or slow? These questions have no good answers, but people ask them anyway, as if talking about the horror might somehow make it more manageable. Rumors circulate constantly, each one analyzed and debated with desperate intensity, because anything is better than not knowing. Some people seek meaning in their final days, attempting to create legacy or purpose in the face of annihilation. They write messages they know will never be delivered, attempting to record their experiences for a posterity that will never read them. They create art from whatever materials are available, leaving marks on walls that will be destroyed with everything else. They try to impart wisdom to children who probably won't survive to use it. These efforts are futile but also profoundly human, assertions of value and meaning against a universe that has demonstrated its indifference. Relationships take on desperate intensity. People form connections faster and deeper than they normally would, because there's no time for the usual gradual process of building trust and intimacy. Strangers become confidants within hours. Romantic relationships form between people who would never have noticed each other under normal circumstances, driven by the need for comfort and connection in the face of death. Some of these connections are genuine and provide real solace. Others are simply mutual exploitation, two people using each other to avoid being alone in their final hours. Parents face unique horrors during the waiting period. How do you explain to your children what's happening? Do you tell them they're going to die, that there's no escape, that everything they know will end? Or do you maintain the fiction that everything will be fine, that rescue is coming, that they shouldn't be afraid? Both choices feel like failures, like betrayals of the fundamental parental duty to protect and nurture your children. Some parents try to shield their children from the truth, maintaining normal routines and diversions, telling comforting lies about what the future holds. They succeed for a while, but children are perceptive and eventually realize that something is terribly wrong. The moment when a child understands they're going to die, when you see that knowledge enter their eyes, is perhaps the worst thing a parent can experience. Other parents choose honesty, explaining the situation in terms appropriate to their children's ages and understanding. They spend their remaining time together making memories, expressing love, trying to ensure that their children's final days are filled with as much comfort and security as possible under the circumstances. But there's no way to make this okay, no way to shield children from the existential terror of knowing their lives will end soon. The question of how to handle the final moments with children torments parents constantly. Should you try to ensure they die in their sleep, slipping away peacefully without knowing what's happening? Should you stay with them until the end, holding them as death arrives? Or would that traumatize them further? Some parents make the horrific decision to end their children's lives themselves, believing it's more merciful than whatever the enemy will do. Others cannot bring themselves to do this, hoping against hope that perhaps their children will be spared, even though they know this hope is futile. Elderly individuals face the waiting with different considerations. Many have lived full lives, have achieved what they could achieve, have raised families and left their marks on the world in small ways. For them, the approaching death might be more acceptable, just another ending to a life that had to end eventually anyway. Some elderly people provide comfort and wisdom to younger refugees, drawing on decades of experience to help others cope. But even for the elderly, this death is different from the natural death they might have expected. There's an indignity to it, a violation of the social contract that said, if you worked hard and followed the rules, you would be protected and cared for in your final years. Instead, they're abandoned to die terribly. All their years of service and loyalty counted for nothing. The bitterness of this betrayal affects even those who thought they had made peace with mortality. As the waiting continues, resources dwindle and physical suffering increases, adding new dimensions to the psychological torment. Hunger becomes a constant companion, your body slowly cannibalizing itself as starvation progresses. Thirst drives you to desperate measures, drinking contaminated water that will probably kill you, but at least addresses the immediate burning need. Exhaustion overwhelms you, but sleep brings nightmares that are often worse than waking reality. Disease spreads rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, through populations weakened by malnutrition and stress. Simple infections become life-threatening. Diarrheal illnesses from contaminated water dehydrate people already on the edge. Respiratory diseases spread through crowded shelters where people huddle together for warmth and security. Dying of disease before the enemy arrives becomes increasingly likely, and for many it's almost a relief, a natural death instead of whatever horror the enemy would inflict. The waiting is also punctuated by false alarms and moments of terror. A distant explosion makes everyone think the attack has begun, sending people fleeing or hiding before realizing it was just an industrial accident or structural failure. A rumor that enemy forces have been spotted triggers panic that ripples through entire populations. These false alarms drain energy and hope, crying wolf until people become numb to warnings, which means when the real attack begins, many won't react in time. Some people find their faith strengthened during the waiting, turning to the Emperor with genuine devotion, finding comfort in prayer and ritual. They truly believe that their suffering is a test, that the Emperor has a plan, that faith will be rewarded, even if that reward comes only after death. For these people, The waiting becomes a spiritual journey, a chance to prove their devotion and prepare their souls for whatever lies beyond. Their faith might be misplaced, but it gives them peace that others cannot find. Others lose their faith entirely, cursing the emperor who they believe has abandoned them, rejecting all the teachings they were raised with. They die as atheists or apostates, finding a kind of freedom in rejecting the system that failed them. Some of these people turn to chaos not out of belief, but out of spite, a final middle finger to the Imperium that left them to die. The waiting ends differently for different people. Some die of natural causes before the enemy arrives, their suffering ended by disease or injury or simple giving up. Others survive until the final moments, watching as the enemy breaches the walls, as the killing begins, as everything they feared manifests in reality. The lucky ones die quickly in the initial assault. The unlucky ones survive the first wave and face whatever horrors their particular enemies have planned for prisoners and survivors. Exterminatus from below. For some doomed worlds, the end comes not from invading forces, but from the Imperium itself. Exterminatus, the total destruction of a planet, represents the ultimate expression of the Imperium's ruthless pragmatism. If a world cannot be saved, if it has fallen too deeply to chaos, or will feed a tyrannid hive fleet, if the strategic calculus determines that destruction serves the Imperium better than any other option, then the order will be given, and billions will die in fire from the sky. From the perspective of those on the ground, the first sign of exterminatus is often the withdrawal of any remaining Imperial forces. Soldiers who have been fighting defensive positions for days or weeks suddenly receive orders to fall back to extraction points. Ships that have been ferrying small numbers of refugees suddenly depart and don't return. The sky begins to empty of Imperial vessels as they pull back to safe orbital distances. Then comes the broadcast, if there is one. Sometimes, an inquisitor or chapter master will announce the decision, explaining in cold terms that the world is lost, that its destruction is necessary, that those remaining should prepare their souls for the Emperor's judgment. More often, there's simply silence, no warning at all, because what would be the point? You cannot prepare for planetary destruction. You cannot flee when you're on the surface of the world being destroyed. Knowledge of what's coming serves only to increase terror in your final moments. The method of exterminatus varies, and each brings its own form of apocalypse. Cyclonic torpedoes, massive warheads designed specifically for planetary destruction, might be the weapon of choice. These aren't tactical nuclear weapons, though they employ fusion reactions. They're orders of magnitude more powerful, each one capable of cracking continents, triggering tectonic chaos, igniting atmospheric firestorms. When cyclonic torpedoes begin to fall, you might see them as streaks of light across the sky, dozens or hundreds of them descending from orbit, spreading across the planet to ensure total coverage. The first impacts are visible as flashes of light bright enough to burn retinas of anyone who looks directly at them, even from thousands of kilometers away. The sound follows, a thunderous roar that seems to come from everywhere at once as multiple shockwaves converge. The ground itself begins to heave and buckle, tectonic plates shifting under the massive energy release, fault lines snapping with earthquakes that shatter cities and tear open the crust. Volcanoes that have been dormant for millennia suddenly erupt as the planet's internal heat is violently released. Mountains crumble into dust, oceans boil and evaporate, and the very air ignites as atmospheric compression from multiple explosions creates temperatures hotter than the surface of stars. For those in a hive city when the cyclonic bombardment begins, death comes as structural failure on an incomprehensible scale. The massive hive spires, which have stood for centuries or millennia, sway and crumble like sandcastles hit by waves. Billions of tons of ferrocrete and adamantium collapse inward, crushing everyone in the lower levels. The upper levels tumble, their inhabitants falling kilometers through clouds of debris, dying from the fall long before they would hit the ground. that's rising up to meet them as the planet's crust convulses. You feel the vibrations first, a deep rumbling that travels through the hive structure, growing in intensity until the very walls are shaking, until you can barely stand. Then comes the sound, a roar so loud it's felt as physical pain, as your eardrums rupture and blood runs from your ears. The air itself becomes crushing as pressure waves slam through the hive, bursting lungs, collapsing organs, killing without visible wounds. If by some horrible chance you survive the initial impacts, if your section of the hive hasn't collapsed and you're somehow still alive, what follows is worse. The atmosphere itself ignites, a firestorm that engulfs the entire planet as oxygen burns at temperatures that can melt ceramite. The hive becomes an oven, temperatures rising so quickly that people combust spontaneously. Their bodies flash vaporized before their nerves can even register pain. Virus bombing represents a different kind of exterminatus, one that initially seems less immediately violent, but is ultimately just as total. The Life Eater virus, a biological weapon of horrifying potency, is released in the upper atmosphere in specially designed warheads. It spreads quickly, riding wind currents, seeping down through every layer of the atmosphere until it touches the surface. The virus kills everything biological it contacts. Everything. Humans, animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, viruses, everything with organic chemistry in its composition. It works quickly, breaking down cellular structures in minutes, reducing flesh and plant matter to a putrid sludge. The death it brings is agonizing, your body literally liquefying from the inside out, nerves firing in constant torment until they too dissolve. You might try to seal yourself in, hiding in airtight bunkers or sealed sections of the hive, but the virus is incredibly persistent and finds its way through the smallest gaps. Ventilation systems that couldn't be completely shut down become vectors for death. Airlocks that weren't perfectly sealed let in enough contaminated atmosphere to kill everyone inside. You watch as everyone around you begins to sicken, their skins sloughing off, their eyes melting, their screams becoming gurgles as their throats dissolve. The truly horrible aspect of virus bombing is that the virus doesn't just kill individuals. It kills the entire biosphere. Every ecosystem, every food source, everything that made the planet capable of supporting life is destroyed. Even if you somehow survived the initial virus release, you would die slowly of starvation on a world that has become a dead ball of dissolved organic matter. And there's a second stage to virus bombing that makes survival even more impossible. As the virus breaks down all organic matter, it releases enormous quantities of flammable gases, methane, and other hydrocarbons from decomposing biomass. The planet's atmosphere becomes saturated with these gases. Then, the fleet in orbit fires incendiary weapons into the atmosphere, igniting the entire thing in a firestorm that makes cyclonic torpedo strikes look gentle by comparison. If anyone somehow survived the virus, they're incinerated in this secondary effect, burned to ash in fires that consume what was once an entire world's worth of life. Atmospheric incinerators might be used alone, without virus bombing, particularly if the threat is tyrannid infestation. These weapons superheat the atmosphere to temperatures that ensure nothing survives. The process is slower than cyclonic torpedoes, taking hours rather than minutes, but the result is just as thorough. You watch as the sky itself begins to glow, as temperatures rise degree by degree, as the hive becomes an oven that grows steadily hotter. You sweat at first, then dehydrate rapidly as your body cannot cool itself against the rising heat. Your skin blisters and burns. You seek shelter in the deepest parts of the hive, but the heat penetrates everywhere, conducted through metal and stone, until there is nowhere cool enough to survive. Eventually, you lose consciousness from heat exhaustion, a small mercy before your body cooks and your flesh carbonizes in temperatures hot enough to melt lead. From orbit, Exterminatus is clinically efficient, a necessary evil carried out with the push of a button and a brief prayer for the souls of the condemned. From the surface, it's an apocalypse in the most literal sense. The ending of worlds, the termination of billions of lives in fire and violence. And the cruelest part is that you know, in whatever moments of consciousness remain to you as your world dies, that this death was ordered by the very Imperium you served, carried out by forces sworn to protect humanity, justified by calculations that determined your deaths, served a greater good that you will never see. The consumed. If tyrannids have come for your world, and exterminatus hasn't been ordered, or hasn't arrived in time, you face perhaps the most complete and terrible form of planetary death imaginable. You don't just die, you become part of something else, incorporated into an alien entity so vast and hungry that individual lives are beneath its notice. The final stages of tyrannid planetary consumption follow a brutal pattern that has been observed on world after world, always the same, as inevitable as a chemical reaction. By this point, the military resistance has collapsed. The cities have been overrun. The last organized human activity has ceased. What remains is the harvest. The xenos organisms that have been transforming your world's biosphere have completed their work. The vegetation, the air, the very chemistry of your planet has been altered into something optimal for tyrannid digestion. Strange plant-like growths cover every surface, nothing natural but everything organic, pulsing with alien life. The sky has darkened with spores and biological matter, the sun barely visible through layers of organic haze. The ground itself has become soft and yielding, more flesh than earth, warm to the touch and faintly pulsing. Capillary towers have grown across the planet's surface, massive biological structures that reach from ground to high atmosphere, their bases anchored in vast digestion pools. These towers are the mechanism by which all of your world's biomass will be transferred to the hive fleet, pumped up through organic conduits to the bioships waiting in orbit. The tyrannids drive you toward these digestion pools like cattle to slaughter. Hormagaunts and gargoyles herd any surviving humans, not killing but directing, forcing you to move in specific directions through a landscape that has become alien and hostile. You have no choice but to comply. Behind you are organisms that will rip you apart if you resist. Ahead is the pool, but approaching it at least delays the end a few moments longer. The digestion pools are vast, sometimes kilometers across, filled with a thick liquid that's more organic soup than water. It's warm, uncomfortably so, and it smells of corruption and alien chemistry, scents your human nose was never designed to process. The surface roils and bubbles with activity, things moving beneath the surface, partially dissolved biomass being broken down by enzymes and bacteria designed specifically for this purpose. As you're driven to the pool's edge, you see others ahead of you walking into the liquid of their own accord. They're not moving voluntarily, not in any real sense. They've been infected with tyrannid organisms that have taken control of their nervous systems, that puppet their bodies while their minds remain aware but helpless. You can see the horror in their eyes, even as their faces remain blank, even as their legs continue to march them forward into the dissolution that awaits. Your turn comes. Perhaps you fight, trying to resist, trying to flee, but there are always more tyrannids ready to ensure compliance. Perhaps you're already infected yourself, feeling the alien presence in your mind, feeling control being stripped away as something else directs your muscles. Perhaps you simply walk forward because there's nowhere else to go, because resistance is futile, because at least this way it will end. The liquid of the digestion pool burns when you first contact it, not with heat, but with chemical aggression as it begins to break down your flesh. You wade deeper, forced by tyrannid organisms, or by your own hijacked nervous system, or simply by the pressure of others behind you. The burning intensifies as more of your skin is exposed to the enzymes. You try to scream, but the sound is lost among thousands of others screaming the same terror, the same agony,
the same realization that you're being digested alive. You sink deeper, the liquid rising past your waist, your chest, your shoulders. Your flesh is dissolving, being broken down into component nutrients that will feed the hive fleet. The pain is comprehensive, every nerve firing at once, your body being unmade at the cellular level, while consciousness persists far longer than seems possible. You feel yourself coming apart, feel the boundaries of your body dissolving into the pool, feel your identity dispersing into the biomass soup. Your head sinks beneath the surface. You can't breathe, but drowning is the least of your concerns. You're being absorbed, incorporated, consumed. Everything that made you an individual, all your memories and thoughts and feelings, all the loves and hates and hopes and fears, all of it is being reduced to proteins and genetic information, raw materials to be pumped up through the capillary towers to the bioships above. The Tyranids don't harvest just your body, they harvest your genetic information, your DNA analyzed and catalogued, any useful traits identified and incorporated into the hive mind's vast genetic library. Something of you will persist in that library, not you as a person, but you as data, as a collection of genetic sequences that might be expressed in future Tyranid organisms if they prove useful. It's a kind of immortality, but one so divorced from any human concept of life or identity that it might be worse than simple oblivion. The process continues for days or weeks across the entire planet. Every human, every animal, every plant, everything with organic chemistry is driven or drawn into the digestion pools. The pools overflow and merge, forming vast seas of dissolving biomass. The capillary towers pulse and throb as they pump this nutrient-rich slurry up to the hive fleet, transferring the essential matter and energy of an entire world's biosphere to the bioships. Even after all visible life has been consumed, the harvest continues. The Tyranids dig deeper, extracting microorganisms from soil, filtering the oceans for microscopic life, scraping the atmosphere for any airborne spores or bacteria. They mine deposits of fossil fuels, ancient biomass compressed and transformed over millennia, because even that contains energy and matter they can use. They're incredibly thorough, driven by a hunger that accepts nothing less than total consumption. The final stage is the most complete. Enormous bioships descend from orbit, equipped with specialized organs for large-scale extraction. They hover at low altitude, extending proboscis-like structures down to the surface, and simply drink. They suck up oceans, the water itself containing dissolved organic matter and minerals. They siphon the atmosphere, extracting oxygen and nitrogen and any other useful elements. They strip mine the surface, taking anything that can be processed and used. When the hive fleet finally departs, what remains is a dead world in the most complete sense. No atmosphere, no water, no soil, no life, not even bacteria or viruses. The surface is airless rock, scoured down to bare mineral, devoid of any organic chemistry whatsoever. The planet's mass is slightly less than it was before the Tyranids arrived, thousands or millions of tons of matter having been transferred to the hive fleet and carried away. This is your final fate if consumed by Tyranids, to be rendered down to component elements, incorporated into an alien organism, spread across 1,000 different bioships and bioforms, distributed throughout the hive fleet as it moves to its next target. You don't leave a corpse to mark your passing. You don't leave ruins for archaeologists to study. You don't leave anything at all except a barren rock that orbits a sun in silence. All evidence that you ever existed, erased as thoroughly as if you had never been born. Closing, echoes in the void. In the vast darkness of the galaxy, worlds die every day. The Imperium loses planets to invasion, rebellion, natural disaster, and calculated sacrifice at a rate that would horrify anyone capable of grasping the scale.
Billions of human lives are extinguished, their stories ending in terror and violence, their deaths recorded only as statistics in administratum reports, if they're recorded at all. For those left behind on doomed worlds, there is no glory and little meaning to be found in their fate. The Imperium's propaganda speaks of noble sacrifice, of duty fulfilled, of martyrdom in the Emperor's service. But the reality is simply mass death, the casual discarding of populations deemed too expensive to save or too unimportant to matter. You die not as a hero, but as an inconvenience, an acceptable loss in calculations so vast that individual lives vanish into rounding errors. Some worlds leave survivors, small numbers who escape at the last moment or who endure in isolated pockets after the main assault passes. These survivors carry trauma that never fully heals, nightmares that persist through decades, guilt over outliving those who died. They become refugees scattered across the Imperium, often unwelcome wherever they settle, marked by their origin from a dead world, suspected of taint or corruption, never fully integrated into their new homes. These survivors are the only witnesses to what happened, the only voices that can tell the stories of worlds that died. But their testimony is often suppressed by the Inquisition, which prefers to maintain control over information about planetary losses. Too many stories of worlds abandoned might create unrest, might lead populations to question whether the Imperium truly protects them, might expose the brutal calculus that determines who lives and who dies. The Imperium prefers sanitized histories, where dead worlds are noble sacrifices, rather than admissions of failure or resource allocation decisions. Official records might say that a world fell defending the Emperor's domain, when the truth is that it was simply abandoned because saving it wasn't cost-effective. They might describe heroic last stands by loyal defenders, when the reality was chaotic collapse and desperate attempts to flee. The propaganda serves its purpose, maintaining morale and faith throughout the Imperium, but it's built on the graves of billions whose actual experiences were nothing like the official narratives. For the countless dead, there are no monuments, no remembrance ceremonies, no individual recognition of their suffering and loss. Their numbers in reports, populations of worlds that no longer exist, statistical casualties in a war that has raged for 10,000 years and shows no sign of ending. Their names are lost, their lives forgotten, their final moments unrecorded except in the memories of the dead. But in some small way, their deaths serve a purpose, though not the one the Imperium claims. Every planet that falls to Xenos invasion provides data about enemy tactics and capabilities. Every world consumed by Tyranids teaches the Imperium something about how the hive fleets operate. Every planetary evacuation, however chaotic and incomplete, refines the procedures that might save slightly more lives on the next doomed world. The dead buy time and knowledge with their lives, not through any choice they made, but simply by being in the path of forces beyond their control. The Imperium continues, vast and grinding, consuming worlds and populations with the same mechanical indifference it shows to everything else. New worlds are colonized to replace those lost. New populations are born to replace those dead. The great machine of imperial governance and military power rolls forward, crushing everything in its path, but also preserving some fragment of humanity through its brutal efficiency. For those of us fortunate enough to live on worlds that haven't yet been marked for doom, the fate of the abandoned serves as reminder and warning. We are not special. We are not irreplaceable. If the calculus shifts, if our world's strategic value changes, if the enemies of mankind come for us and the cost of defense exceeds the benefit, we too will be left behind. We too will watch the evacuation ships depart without us. We too will face whatever doom descends from the stars, abandoned by the Imperium we serve. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where human life is the cheapest commodity and death the most common fate. This is what it means to be left behind on a doomed planet in Warhammer 40,000. Not a glorious sacrifice, but a mundane tragedy, one of billions that occur across the galaxy, each one containing uncounted individual stories of suffering and loss that will never be told. In the end, you are simply another casualty of the Imperium's endless wars, another life deemed acceptable to lose, another voice silenced in the darkness. You die alone or among billions, it makes no difference. You die screaming or in silent acceptance, the outcome is the same. You die faithful to the Emperor or cursing his name, and no one will ever know which it was. This is your fate, should you find yourself on the wrong world at the wrong time, left behind as the Imperium moves on, forgotten before you even finish dying. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the horror of being left behind in Warhammer 40,000, please like this video and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more explorations of the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war, and sometimes being left behind to face it alone is the most terrible fate of all.